Today, I am delighted to be welcoming to conversation with me, Steve Pifer. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I welcome you on behalf of the Sebastopol World Friends and all the guests at our friendship dinner who will be watching this interview. Let me introduce you, Steve, so that our listeners know a little bit about who you are. You have been a research fellow at Stanford University. You are soon bound for Berlin, where you will be a research fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. You have a long career in the Foreign Service, extending back into, I guess, the early 90s.
Actually, the late 1970s.
Late 1970s. So you got into Foreign Service right out of college, it sounds like. And you have been a former ambassador to Ukraine. You served there from 1998 to 2000. And it also sounds like you have had positions in embassies in other places as well. Where else have you been posted to?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm sorry I can't join you in real time, but 3:30 in the morning in Berlin was not the best time to be doing this, so I'm glad we could pre-tape this.
Yes.
No, I had a great 27-year career in the Foreign Service. In addition to Kyiv, I also served in Warsaw, Moscow, and London. Spent time in Geneva in the 1980s at the nuclear arms talks. And then in Washington, spent about 2.5 years detailed to the White House, the National Security Council staff. So it was a great career. Anybody out there who's looking for a fascinating work, public service, and some opportunities to do some fairly important things, I highly recommend the Foreign Service.
You also, though, when we spoke a little bit, you told me that you consider Sebastopol home.
Yep.
And that you have deep ties to Sebastopol. Mm-hmm. So when did you move to Sebastopol?
Well, my mother, my brother, and I moved from the San Francisco Peninsula up to Sebastopol back in 1966. And so it was in Sebastopol where I went to junior high school. I attended and graduated from Annalee. And those were sort of my formative years. So I look back and I say that was really kind of my hometown experience. Yeah. And I kept the ties in part because a lot of my Annalee friends stayed, within the area. Mm-hmm. My mother continued actually to live in the house that I lived in when I went to high school up until when she passed away a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And I actually used that address as my permanent legal address when I was in the Foreign Service. Foreign Service is kind of like military. You're moving every 2 or 3 years. So you usually try to find some address that's going to have some permanency. So I used that up until the time when I retired from the Foreign Service back in 2004. And I still look back on Sebastopol as it was a delightful place to grow up in. And every time I go back there, I kind of remind myself that I miss it.
Yeah. Well, Sebastopol would be happy to have you move home if a chance ever arises. So here in Sebastopol, we've had connections to Ukraine since its very earliest days, really, as an independent country through our sister city, Chehirin. Mm-hmm. We formed that connection, and that's a time period that you are somewhat of an expert on. You wrote a book that came out in 2017 that looked at the early the establishment of Ukraine as an independent country. The name of your book for our listeners is The Eagle and the Trident. And I just wanted to ask you, in your book, you talk about the major challenges facing Ukraine were, on the one hand, taking on economic and political reforms, and on the other hand, establishing a new relationship with Russia. So how do you think that's all going lately for Ukraine?
Well, I think right now, actually, let me just comment on the point you made about the connections between California and Ukraine. And it's not just the California National Guard, but within Sonoma County, they continue 3 sister city relationships between Santa Rosa and Cherkasy. And Cherkasy was an interesting town because when I was in Ukraine in the late 1990s, that was the training center for our Peace Corps volunteers. So they would come to Cherkasy, they would go through an orientation program, language training, before they spread out all around Ukraine. And then Sonoma had a relationship with Kaniv. And Kaniv is also famous because it's the place where Shevchenko, sort of the Ukrainian national poet, is buried. And then there's the connection to Sebastopol. My understanding was originally there was talk about pairing Sebastopol with Sevastopol in Crimea.
Yes.
And Sebastopol actually, of course, is named after Sevastopol, or at least Sevastopol in the Crimean War is what gave them the idea for the Sebastopol name. But then I think wiser heads prevailed and said, Sebastopol, a small farming community, 7,000 people in Sevastopol, a major port that was housing a good portion of the Russian Navy. The connections really didn't make a lot of sense. So they settled on Chiherin, which actually has a history of its own. And as I was reminded when I went to Chiherin in 1998, I was not the first ambassador to go there because Chiherin had been the capital of Bohdan Khmelnytsky back in the 1600s, and at one point apparently hosted 11 different embassies from countries around Europe.
Wow.
So there's this interesting history and these connections that I think are, and we can talk about those maybe a little bit later. But in terms of Ukraine today, I think the country really faces two challenges. One is external, Russia, and the other is internal. And it was clear from the time that Ukraine regained its independence in 1991 that it had this large neighbor, Russia. And I think that for most Russians, the hardest piece of the Soviet Union to lose when the Soviet Union collapsed was Ukraine. Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire going back to the mid-1600s, with the exception of a short couple of years after World War I. Russians referred to Ukrainians as Little Russians. I'm not sure a lot of Ukrainians like that term. But I think emotionally, for Russians, it was hard to lose Ukraine. And that's been a very complicated relationship. And it, of course, became much more complicated after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, when Russian military forces seized Crimea, and Russia subsequently annexed Crimea. And then a couple of months later, you begin to see Russian security forces. They tried to portray themselves as a separatist movement. But it's pretty clear that the conflict that's gone on in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass for the last almost 7 years now, was instigated by Russian security forces. There's been Russian leadership, Russian funding, Russian heavy weapons, ammunition. And in several cases, there's very strong evidence that regular units of the Russian army were fighting in Ukraine. And of course, the Russians provided the missile that was used, unfortunately, to shoot down the Malaysian airliner back in 2014. So you have that conflict going on. And there's a difference. I don't believe the Russians want to annex Donbass, but they're using Donbass as a tool. It's a mechanism to put pressure on the government in Kyiv, to distract it, to divert its attention, to destabilize it, to make it harder to get on with what it needs to do to make Ukraine a successful state. So that's the external challenge. And although the conflict the violence has died down in the last 5 or 6 months, but it's still a simmering conflict, and it's still possible for the Russians to ratchet that up. So that's the external challenge. The internal challenge is continuing getting in place the rest of the reforms that Ukraine needs, and putting in place the anti-corruption measures to get the economy functioning in a normal way, where it's basically serving the interests of the people, not just certain privileged oligarchs. And I think there's a bit of frustration now in that, although there was a lot of hope and expectation when the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, came to office back in May of 2019, a lot of hope that he would be changed and that he would finish these reforms, that he would reduce the outsized political and economic influence of the oligarchs and allow the economy to grow and really take a swipe at corruption. Looking back over 2020, he seems to have gone off course on that. So that's a problem.
Yeah. What are your hopes for the next chapter with new administration coming in? I mean, in brief, what are you hoping 2021 brings the U.S. and the Ukrainian relationship?
Well, I think the Biden presidency will be good for Ukraine. Now, let me say, it's been kind of interesting over the past 4 years during the Trump administration, is if you look at actual American policy towards Ukraine, it's continued to be supportive, provided military support, including lethal military assistance. It's continued sanctions on Russia. It's continued to have American forces in Ukraine, training Ukrainian forces. So it's actually been a pretty good policy. I would call it was really a continuation of the last couple of years of the Obama administration's policy. The question mark, though, that you've had is that while you've had this policy, there's always been the question, did Donald Trump agree with that policy?
Yeah.
And I think that made people nervous. And of course, the one major interaction that we saw with by President Trump with Ukraine was an extortion effort that led to his impeachment.
Yeah.
With President Biden, or now President-elect Biden, but soon to be President Biden, you're going to have somebody who understands Ukraine. He traveled there 6 times as vice president. He understands the importance of a stable, successful Ukraine for the American vision of a Europe that's whole, free, and stable. I think he understands the Russia challenge. And so you're not going to see this dichotomy between the president and his policy. They'll match. But I also think that President Biden can be important for Ukraine is that he can apply tough love when needed. He will be prepared, I think, and I hope to put some pressure on President Zelensky to do the right thing to help Ukraine get to the point, where it can really fully unleash the country's potential. And I think, unfortunately, since Mr. Zelensky has diverted from that reform path, we're going to push. We're going to have to push, and I think that the Biden administration will do that.
Yeah. So shifting our lens from sort of the top of the relationship, nation with nation, Sebastopol World Friends, we talk a lot about grassroots diplomacy. That's really the motivating force behind what we do is that we are peace builders through relationship building. That's our motto, is building peace one friend at a time. And I just wanted to hear from you about how do you think that works in terms of movements like this? Like, can these small kind of movements at the grassroots level, do they have an effect on international relationships?
Yes, I'm a big fan of these kinds of grassroots people-to-people contacts. And in fact, one thing that I'm kind of proud of is in my last year in Ukraine, we were able to adjust our assistance priorities so that we were able to increase the number of exchanges or the number of Ukrainians that come to the United States on various exchanges by about 80%. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I'll give you, I think, really 2 or 3 reasons. One is, I think most Americans are pretty likable people. I mean, and having a Ukrainian come and spend, even a week, or if it's a case of an exchange student here at Annalee or El Molino for a year, they're going to get a pretty good image of America and a pretty good impression of America. And I think they carry that back. And who knows where that high school student's going to be 25 or 30 years down the road. So we're planting some seeds. Second, Sebastopol, I know, has hosted, there's a number of exchange programs that go on that will bring, say, 6 or 7 Ukrainians over and to look at specific issues. How does the city authorities in Sebastopol, how do they deal with certain challenges? Mm-hmm. And it's an opportunity for Sebastopol to share its experience with somebody from small towns in Ukraine. But it's also a two-way opportunity. I mean, there actually may be some chances for the Ukrainians to say, well, gee, that's an interesting question. Here's how we deal with it in Ukraine. So this can be a two-way exchange. So I think there can be some real value there. And I think these exchange programs, they bear fruit. And you may not see it immediately. But later on, who knows, this could be members of parliament, they could be ministers. And the fact that they had a chance to spend 3 weeks or in some cases a year or a couple of years in the United States shapes, in my mind, a fairly positive impression that they have about America. And that's a good thing. Just one other anecdote, I remember going to, I guess it was in Odessa, on the Black Sea in southern Ukraine. And I had a chance to talk to some high school students. It was actually two groups of 30. One was a group of 30 kids who the next week were going on an airplane and then go to 30 different cities around the United States and spend a year in an American high school. The other group had just returned from their year. And it was night and day. I mean, one of these kids had spent a year in Texas. He had been a soccer player in Ukraine, ended up playing on the football team as their place kicker, and came back not only with this great command of English, but with this Texan drawl. And just so you could sort of see, the kids who are going over a little bit nervous because they're going 5,000 miles away from home. But then when they were talking to the ones who'd come back, I mean, seeing the opportunities that they were going to have just to see some really different and some interesting things. And again, my sense is those who came back all came back with very positive views of America. And that makes diplomacy easier. I mean, to the extent that you're working in a country and trying to encourage that country to adopt policies and positions that align well with American interests, to the extent that you have people in that country who are favorably inclined towards Americans, that makes the job a lot easier.
Yeah. Well, we sent a delegation a few years ago, and, our relationship remains strong. And to just follow up on the point you were making a little while ago, some of those young professionals who came and attended programs here in Sebastopol, that information is definitely percolating in their community. And now we're seeing people running for office, stepping up into leadership roles,
This is great. Yeah. And I think some of those people probably had no idea that they would be doing that. And then after spending a couple of weeks in Sebastopol, said, hey, there are things that you can do at the local level. And this actually is a good time to have people like that, because there has been, I think, one positive thing, or very positive thing that's taken place in the last several years in Ukraine is they've pushed more authority down towards the municipal and regional level. So a mayor in Ukraine in a small town now has more authority, but also more resources than would have been the case 20 years ago. And again, when I've talked to people in Ukraine in the last year or so, they said that a lot of things are changing at the local level because these local authorities now have the power to do things that 25 years ago would have to have been approved by the central government in Kyiv. And again, I think to the extent that you push authority, responsibility, and accountability down to lower levels, I think that makes for a more efficient government in general.
Yes, and positive change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Well, Steve, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And I look forward to perhaps hosting you at a friendship dinner in person someday.
Happy to do it when I'm in the country and when we're past COVID.
Yes, let's put that intention away. And I wish you all kinds of great things in your work in Berlin.
Thank you very much. And I think there'll be a very successful dinner virtually on Saturday. I'm just sorry I can't be there in person in real time.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Take care now.